Hi, I'm Sarah from Woven Rose Needlecraft, and this is the fourth part of the Woven Rose Guide to Cross Stitch, in which we will be discussing threads. Now, generally with cross stitch, threads fall into one of two categories, the first being stranded cotton and the second being speciality threads. Now, we're going to talk about cotton first. If you are a brand new stitcher, there's a chance that stranded cotton is the only thread you're going to be using in your project. And speciality thread may not be something that you're even considering for quite a while. So if you don't want to stay for that bit and you don't want to become overwhelmed, there's a lot of information about thread. There was a lot of information in the last video about fabric. So if you just want to stay for the cotton, the stranded cotton portion of the video, just to get the basics and then be off, that's absolutely fine. That's fair enough and I totally understand that. So we're going to start by discussing stranded cotton. Now, stranded cotton is the thread or the floss, as it's sometimes known, that is used in the vast majority of cross-stitch projects. It's what comes in most kits, and if you've ever seen cross-stitch or you've seen projects and you're looking at the thread, there's a fairly good chance that the thread used in that project was stranded cotton. So stranded cotton usually comes in these skeins. You'll probably be familiar with the term skein if you're a knitter or a crocheter and you're used to buying yarn. Yarn often comes in skeins, although the construction of the skeins here is a little bit different, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So here's our little skeins of stranded cotton. They are 8 meters long and each thread has 6 smaller strands. I'll show you that in a moment. Of these standard stranded cottons, I would say the most common brands are Mandarin, Anchor and DMC, but DMC really is the forerunner in that trio. Most charts, including this sample here, are charted for DMC. Sometimes they will give you lists of threads and they will give you the option, particularly in magazines, particularly in UK magazines, they will give you a chart or a list for DMC, for Anchor and for Mandarin, but most charts nowadays especially are charted only for DMC. It may be possible to use a different brand, and we'll talk about conversion charts in a moment. So for now, I'm going to assume there's a fair chance that you will be using DMC, and it's DMC that I will be using. So how do I find out what threads I need? Well, I go to my materials list. So just a reminder that our sample piece, the sample piece that I will be stitching in this series, is Angel of Christmas by Lavender and Lace, and I will be stitching not the original red and green version, but the alternate colorway, which is a blue version. So if you start to see blue threads, you'll know that that's why. So I go back to our chart and to our materials list, and again, we were here last week when we were talking about fabric. We're going to ignore the fabric for now because we're finished with that. And we're going to go on to the next part, which is threads. And so it says here DMC. So we know that we're not using Anchor or Mandarin or any other brand. We are using DMC. And then it will have all of these symbols. And the symbols on this legend correspond to the symbols on the chart, so that when you reach a portion of the chart and you see all of these symbols, you just refer back to your materials list and to your legend, and you know which number, which skein corresponds to which symbol, and after a while you'll just start to know it off by heart for your chart. Needless to say, but I feel I probably should say this, that the symbols are different for every chart. So if, I don't know, 3750 is a love heart in this chart. If you have another lavender and lace chart with a love heart, it may well be a completely different shade, but that's probably obvious, but you have to say these things because it can be confusing. So here's all of our symbols, and then beside each symbol we see a number, and the number corresponds to the shade of the thread. So if I just take this little skein of DMC, we'll see that it says 739 So that is, wants to make a run for it, that is the name or the shade number. There you go, 739. There are 3 exceptions to the number rule with DMC. So every single DMC shade, colour, and there's 500 of them, have a number bar 3. And those 3 are ecru, which I have here, which is this ecru colour, a cream colour, blanc, which is white, of course, DMC is a French company, and B5200. You could say B5200 is a number, but it has a B in front of it, so, you know. B5200 is a very, very bright white. So DMC have 2 whites. Blanc is the more subdued white and probably the more commonly used white. B5200 is a very, very bright white. This chart asks for all of these numbers, and then it asks for ecru, which is our cream, and in brackets it has 2. That means that the chart needs 2 skeins, 2 full skeins of ecru, and then it asks for white. It doesn't say blank, it says white. I don't know why they do this. I suppose maybe they think people will understand it better. But if you see white written in a DMC list, a list of DMC threads, white means blanc. It doesn't mean B5200. If they want B5200, they will ask for B5200. Why we can't all use the same language is beyond me, but I'm not going to argue. Okay, so each of these colours we need 1 skein of, except for ecru and white or blanc, of which we need 2. Simple. So you need to get out your chart or your materials list if you're looking at it online, and you need to see all the skeins of thread that you have and how many skeins of each one you need. And that's your first job. So now that we have our skein of DMC in front of us, we need to know how to use it. You can't obviously stitch with it like this, so we need to take out a length of thread, to remove a length of thread. So how do we do that? Well, we don't remove these little plastic bands, leave them where they are for now, but we find the bottom band, the one with the number, the code written on it, and we should be able to find a loose end. Now in this case it's quite easy, our loose end is just poking out here. Sometimes you might have to slide up this bottom band and have a little rummage until you find the loose end. The cut end is there, I promise. So once you've found it, hold your skein quite firmly in your hand, take your loose end and then start pulling it, and you'll notice it just starts coming out quite freely. Now, how do we know how long we need to cut our piece of thread? The length of the thread that you're going to pull out depends on a few different factors. The first factor is if you're going to be using it as is, or if you're going to be doubling it over. And the second factor is how comfortable you are stitching with a longer thread. And if you mind that it may have a few knots in it, or if you would rather have a longer thread and just be able to keep stitching, or if you would rather have a shorter thread and have to keep starting more regularly. Now that may sound like absolute gibberish at this moment in time, but I hope that in a few minutes when I start to explain this, it will make sense. When I was first learning how to stitch, I was always told that you pull the thread out to the length of your arm. So you would pull it out, I mean I do have quite long arms, but you would pull it out to about there, and then you would cut it here. And again, that might seem quite long, but bear with me for a minute and it'll make sense. So you'd cut it here. Now I actually like to cut mine 1 meter long, and that's because of the way I store the threads, and again I'll talk about that in a little bit. So I get out my measuring tape and then I pull and pull and pull, and now we're at 100 centimeters, and I'm going to give it a little snip here. So I get 8 of these lengths out of a skein of thread, because one of these skeins has 8 meters of thread in it. Now I have this piece of thread which is 1 meter long, but I can't stitch with it like this because this is so thick. I mean, maybe an embroiderer would be using thread this thick, but as cross stitchers, we're never going to do it. So we need to take out one strand. Now, stranded cotton is made up of 6 individual strands. So we have 6 little strands of thread in our bigger piece of thread, and we need to take out one. Even if you need 2, always take out one at a time. Trying to pull out more than one at a time is going to give you a big knot, and we don't want that. So here we have our 6 strands. I'm going to take one, and then holding the bigger thread firmly, I'm going to pull out my little thread. So here's my single strand of cotton, and this we'll put aside for a moment over there. And then once I have my single strand, well, most of the time we're going to be using it doubled over. Why is that? Because most of the time when we stitch with stranded cotton, we are stitching with 2 strands of cotton, and you can either pull out 2 strands and use them side by side, or what most stitchers do is they take their long piece and they double it over. So that gives us 2 strands. Technically, we have 1 strand, but it's 2 strands because it's doubled over. And that makes, if I just pull out a needle, probably should have had my needle out earlier, but anyway, if I take my needle, I now have a little loop where I doubled over my thread, and the loop makes it quite easy to thread our needle. That loop will also come in very handy for the loop start method, and when we get on to part 7, I think, where we're actually going to be starting stitching, we'll talk a lot more about the loop start method, and then it'll probably become a little bit clearer why I personally always like to have a loop at the end of my thread. You can see that that's a much more manageable length than the big long piece of thread we had at the start, and I've left my tail quite long as well just to make it more manageable. And then of course, as we stitch and that thread diminishes in length, we'll pull it out so that the tail becomes shorter and shorter. So that's how you cut your length of thread and how you pull out your single strand. And that's really all you need to know about that. So one other thing that is quite important to mention is about using older skeins of DMC or whatever your thread of choice is. So what can happen is a lot of people, and new stitchers especially, can go to charity shops or car boot sales, or in America you might have a garage sale, which I always think sounds quite fun, and find people's collections of DMC or whatever stranded cotton. And it can be at a really good price, and you might think, fantastic, here's 100 skeins of DMC to get me started in my collection for a really, really low price. Brilliant. Well, it is brilliant to an extent. You have to be very, very careful when using older skeins of DMC or older skeins of any stranded cotton. And the reason is because some of the colours over time have changed. So a skein of whatever this is, 739 from 2025 and a skein of 739 from 2000 may not be exactly the same colour. And that is not because DMC are not staying on top of their Dyelots and their dyeing regime. It's because over time certain ingredients have become impossible to source. Some ingredients and some dyes have been banned, and we're particularly seeing this in Europe within the EU, that there are dyes which can no longer be used within the EU, and so DMC have had to change their dyes ever so slightly. There are also a few examples of thread colours which are available in the United States but are not available in Europe or maybe other parts of the world. I can think of a few examples of this, and that again is because the dyes are allowed in the US but are not allowed within the EU. The EU are very, very strict on certain ingredients and dyes, and I know that this affects cosmetics, and I know that it especially is affecting perfume We're not here to talk about perfume though, of course we're here to talk about thread. So why am I saying all of this? Because if you get a skein of thread from 20 years ago and you put it next to a skein of thread from this year, it may look slightly different. And if you then put them in the same project and mix them, and they're supposed to look exactly the same, they can end up looking different, and that can be really, really noticeable in a cross-stitch piece, especially a full coverage piece. So if you have those older skeins, by all means use them, but maybe use them in projects where you only need one of them, so you're not mixing an old skein and a modern skein, or maybe use them in projects where maybe something like a sampler, where the exact colour isn't as important as it would be in, let's say, a full coverage chart. So just something to bear in mind if you do have those older skeins that may have been dyed using slightly different dyes or ingredients. Just always keep in mind that they may be a tiny bit different. And once that's in your mind and you're aware of it, you probably won't go wrong. It won't become an issue. So speaking of getting our colours and our shades exactly right, I would like to quickly just talk about converting charts from one brand to another. So for example, our Angel of Christmas is charted for DMC. Now let's say I had an Anchor collection and not a DMC collection, or I had a shop near me that sold Anchor but not DMC. Could I stitch it with Anchor? Yes and no. There are lots of conversion charts that will tell you if you need this colour in DMC, this is the closest colour in Anchor, or vice versa, or whatever amongst all the different brands. If you're charting a sampler, for example, like what's behind me, that is absolutely perfect because the colours are going to be close enough that it doesn't really matter. If you look at this sampler or any sampler, usually you have these kind of blocks of colour, and if the red in the Anchor isn't exactly the same as the red in the DMC, it doesn't really matter. You're going to get the same effect because you're using those kind of blocks of colour. You've green and then you've red, and you only have one shade of this and you only have one shade of this, so it's fine. The problem would occur in something like a full coverage chart where you could have 10 blues all next to each other and they all look pretty much the same, but when you stitch them together in a full coverage piece, they create this incredible effect. Now, if you swap out all them DMCs for Anchor, you're never going to get it exactly the same. And that can mean that the effect in your full coverage is somewhat diminished. So I wouldn't do it for full coverage. I would do it for a sampler. I wouldn't care. I think it's going to be just as nice and it's be fine. It would be fine. For something like our sample piece, I would be on the fence because the blues in her dress, or the red and greens in her dress in the picture, have been chosen for a very specific reason as to how they interact with each other and the effect that they make, and all those colours in her wings. I would be concerned using a different brand that you wouldn't get the exact same effect. So for something like that, I would probably stick with the recommended thread. So that's just something to bear in mind when you are thinking about conversions. Conversions are used a lot in charts that have been charted originally for silk. A lot of designers like to use silk. Silk is beautiful, but silk is also quite expensive. So often what the designer will do is they will say, look, these are the silk threads that we recommend. If you don't want to buy silk, here's the DMC that we recommend. And usually they will have thought about it and you will get just as good of an effect. So just something to really, really bear in mind when you're thinking, or if you're thinking about using a different brand than what is recommended. Now, just one final word on cotton thread before we move on to speciality thread, and that is just to talk about hand-dyed threads. So here I have some examples of hand-dyed cotton thread. These ones are from Karen. You may have heard of Karen water lilies. These are Karen wildflowers, these beautiful hand-dyed cotton threads. And then I have two more little mini skeins here of thread from Thread Pickers, again hand-dyed. And I hope you can see they have this beautiful variegated effect, and that goes for both the Thread Picker threads and the Karen wildflowers. This beautiful variegated effect where the thread sort of changes colour as you move along, and it's really, really beautiful. These do not come in your regular skeins like our DMC and our anchor, and nor do they come with 6 strands in our thread. But if you do end up using these, it's quite easy to get to grips with how to use them. It's not that much different to how you would use a regular DMC or anchor skein. The reason that I wanted to bring these up is just to very quickly talk about colour fastness. Now, the Karen ones do say they are colour fast, but with a warning, and the Thread Pickers say that they're not colour fast. Why is that important? If you're going to wash your piece. We will be talking about washing cross stitch further down the line, but whilst our DMC and our anchor is colour fast, so if we wash it, it's not going to leach out dye everywhere. And last week we talked about fabric colour fastness. It's also important to remember that not every thread is colour fast. And if you're going to use these little guys, or if you happen to find some beautiful hand-dyed thread of your own, just be very, very careful that it may not be colour fast, and you may not be safe, if you want, from having dye seepage and leakage problems if you wash your piece. But perhaps if you're only using a little bit, what you could do is stitch your whole piece, wash your piece, let it dry, iron it, do all of that, and then use your non-colour fast thread, because they're absolutely stunning. And I actually have a project that I have these put aside for, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to finish all of the stitching, wash it, iron it, dry it, all the rest of that, and then use these little guys. So I kind of get the best of both worlds. But yeah, just some more unusual cotton threads that you may come across, perhaps not at the very beginning of your stitching, but along the line. And they're really, really beautiful, and they're just something a little bit different. So now that we have hopefully familiarized ourselves with the stranded cotton, we can talk about some of the more exciting threads, the speciality threads. Now, what is a speciality thread? It's a bit of a broad term, because some people would argue what constitutes a speciality thread and what doesn't. But here's how I view speciality threads, basically as everything that's not cotton. So I would include metallic threads, I would include our Wisper thread, which is our fluffy thread, I would include something like a bamboo thread, which is quite unusual, and I would also include silk. And this is where the controversy could begin, because a lot of people will say, well, silk thread isn't a speciality thread, but it's not cotton. So in my head, it's a speciality thread. It's also not something I use very often. It's quite a treat. So should we start with silk? Maybe we should. Okay, so here I have Splendor Silk. This is Rainbow Gallery's silk offering. A lot of companies make silk thread and specialize in silk thread. Perhaps you've heard of Dinky Dyes or MPI silks or Gloriana silks and so on and so forth. But Splendor is the one I have here to show you. And if I just move it in the light, I don't know if you can see, it is absolutely glorious. The gleam and the shine that you get from silk is absolutely beautiful. And as you would expect, if you've ever had a piece of silk clothing or a silk scarf, or I know silk pillow slips and pillowcases are all the rage, silk is an absolutely glorious material, and cross stitch is no different. It is expensive, of course it's expensive, all silk is expensive, and it does require a little bit of care, because although it's beautiful to stitch with and it just slides through your fabric and it kind of spoils you, because once you've stitched with silk you may not want to stitch with anything else. But it does need a little bit of care, and that is particularly prevalent with your hands. So if you've got rough hands, if you're an outdoorsy person, I'm a bit of an outdoorsy person, and often my hands get a little bit rough, maybe, well, you could either take yourself off for a manicure, perfect excuse, or give your hands a bit of an exfoliate and maybe use a nice hand cream just to have nice smooth hands, because any rough skin with silk thread can snag it very easily, whereas cotton is quite a robust thread and it'll just keep on moving. Silk can snag, and it's a real shame because, like I said, 1, it's very pricey, and 2, it's beautiful, and 3, you don't want to lose your thread when you're trying to stitch your piece. So that is our silk. And something that's quite like silk, I think, in a way, is sort of a silk cotton hybrid or middle ground, is bamboo. Now, bamboo is not a material we see being used in thread very often. I think that's an absolute shame. I think it's beautiful. It has a beautiful shine, similar to our silk. It's a little bit more robust than silk, and it is more affordable, more in line with the price of cotton. And so here we have Mandarin floss, and it's 100% bamboo, and like I said, it's absolutely glorious. Could you stitch an entire piece with this stuff? Perhaps if it was, again, like our sampler, because it only has a limited shade range. But if you're stitching a project that maybe you can be a little bit flexible with the shades or doesn't have very many colours, I think bamboo would be a lovely choice. I actually bought these Mandarin floss threads for another lavender and lace piece, which I'm planning on stitching. I've already stitched. It's called Angel of the Morning, but I want to stitch another one, a bigger one, and I want to use this Mandarin floss, I have it in a few different shades, on her cloak. So that's what I bought this for. But I have used it on something else, and it's absolutely glorious. So yeah, that's it, bamboo. So here we have Wisper Thread, and Wisper Thread is a bit of an unusual one. It is a mohair thread. So I think it's 70% kid mohair, 30% nylon, and the nylon there is just to give it a bit of strength and give it a bit of stability, I suppose. Mohair, maybe you've knitted with mohair, maybe you have mohair jumpers, is very, very fluffy. You can probably see that fluffy halo we have here, and not always the easiest to work with, especially when you're using it in a tiny little needle and you're trying to cross stitch and there's just fluff everywhere. Wisper Thread is temperamental, and it's not every stitcher's favourite thread, but it gives an absolutely fantastic effect when you're stitching animal fur, when you're stitching birds' feathers, when you're stitching beards or fur trim on clothing. On our Angel of Christmas sample piece, I'll be using this stuff on her cloak. There's like fluffy parts, or fur I suppose it's supposed to be, on her cloak, and we're going to use Wisper Thread for that. And then when we get to that, we can talk a little bit more how to use it. But yeah, a lot of people see this stuff and run in the opposite direction, but I quite like it. And although it's a bit of hard work and it's a bit temperamental, I think the effect is fantastic. So that's Wisper Thread. Now, there are lots of other types of thread and materials that we could talk about, but we would be here all day and all night. And there really is one speciality thread that I absolutely have to talk about. And it is the one that you're probably going to encounter the first, either in your first piece or in, hopefully you'll continue with the hobby, and you'll have a second and a third chart. And at some point, I promise you, you're going to encounter a chart that calls for this stuff. And this is metallic thread. Now, there are two main types of metallic thread that you'll see on charts, and they are Rainbow Gallery's Petite Treasure Braid and Krynic. Now, my Krynic is a few years old and it's on these spools. But the newer Krynic also comes on these cards. So that's just something to look out for. If you go to your needlework shop, if you're fortunate enough to have a bricks and mortar needlecraft shop near you, don't be looking for these little bobbins or little spools, I should say. You may not find them, but you'll probably find what you're looking for If you're looking for Chronic, you'll probably find it on one of these cards. Metallic thread, again, is not everybody's favorite. It can be a little bit tricky to use. There are a few little tips and tricks when you're using metallic thread to get it to behave. And again, when we get on to our speciality threads on our sample piece, I'll show you a few of those then. But the one thing I think everyone should bear in mind when using metallic thread, and I do think it's something that gets forgotten, is that metallic thread is plastic. And the reason that that is so important to remember is, first of all, you can't expect it to behave like a cotton thread or a silk thread. It's not going to have that flexibility. It's not going to lie perfectly flat. It's not going to glide through your fabric because it's plastic. And the second reason why it's important to remember that this is plastic is if you plan on ironing your piece, please do not put a hot iron on metallic thread, because hot iron plus plastic equals melted, destroyed mess and a heartbroken stitcher. If your chart asks for metallic thread, just be very, very aware that you're reading all of the details it gives. So for example, my chart asks for number 4 braid from Chronic. So I want to be sure that I have a number 4, and that should be written on it. The numbers refer to the thickness, and then it will have a number. So just like our cotton thread, it will say 002 or 205C, which means cord, or 205HL, which means high luster. This will all be written on the actual Chronic, but just be sure that you're not just saying, oh, okay, I need number 205, because there could be different types. It's the same with the Rainbow Gallery, the Petite Treasure braid. There are different types of treasure braid with the same color code. So this is PB02, which is this gold, but just make sure that you're paying attention to all of the details it gives you in the chart so that you're sure you're getting the exact right one. And the same, I forgot to say, the same does apply to our Wisper thread. There are different colors of Wisper thread, and by far the most popular is W88, which is the white, but there are different colors, so just be sure you're paying attention to that. I'm sure that's probably obvious. And then of course our other threads, your silks, your bamboo, they all have numbers or letter, specific codes on them to differentiate the colors. So just be sure you're paying attention to that. But I'm sure, if you can get it right with the cotton, you can get it right with the speciality threads. It really, really is not rocket science. So once you start buying these threads, and especially as you start moving on from project to project to project, and you're buying more and more threads to stitch those pieces, you may find that you're amassing quite a collection of threads. And at that point, you need to start thinking about how on earth you're going to store them. And there's a few different ways. So the first way, and probably the most basic way, is to keep them in their skeins. So like this, and then people like to lay them in drawers all beside each other in number order or maybe in color order. And that works for a lot of people. Some people like to keep these in, they're called floss away bags, but they're basically little plastic bags, and each skein has its own bag. And then if you have, surplus, a bit that you've pulled out and cut, like our little bit here, you can then pop that in the bag as well and keep them together. Another way of dealing with that is to just wrap it around the skein, and that can keep them together. Of course, as you take more and more away from the skein and the skein itself becomes thinner and thinner, that can become a little bit of a mess, but it is an option. Another option, which I have here, is this plastic box. Now this is one of several. There's more than one of these plastic boxes, I can tell you. And in here I have my threads on bobbins, like this. And each bobbin has a little sticker. You can buy these stickers from most needlecraft shops. A little sticker that tells me what shade it is. And then I just take out my bobbin, pull off my thread that I need, stitch with it, and then pop it back and that is the method that I used for the first maybe 2 or 3 years of cross stitching, and I was very happy with my bobbins. Some people don't like the bobbins because they find that it can leave, the bobbins that is, can leave kinks in the thread from where you've wrapped the thread around the bobbin, and that is true. I have to say it never really bothered me, but a lot of people really don't like that. So that's the bobbin system. And then we move into, I mean, there are of course lots of other ways to organize your threads. There's the floss away bags, like I said, there's the bobbins, there's little chips that you can get, there's lots and lots of ways. But my favorite way, and the way that I'm currently storing my collection, is by using a system called Annie's Keepers. So how does the Annie's Keepers system work? Well, you get a kit of these sliders, and these sliders fit into a filing cabinet. I'm going to try and show you a video of that, or a picture of that, so you can kind of see what I mean. But you get lots and lots of these into a filing cabinet. Now, a word of warning before I go any further, they are designed to fit into an American filing cabinet. So if you're in a country that does not use an American sized filing cabinet, just be very careful. Here, our filing cabinets in Ireland are a different size. So I went to IKEA and found a filing cabinet that had an adjustable system, because obviously IKEA sell their stuff everywhere. And with the filing cabinet that I bought, which was called the Alex filing cabinet, you could actually adjust the bars to fit different size files. So that's how I got around it, but just a word of warning about that before you go out and buy yourself a filing cabinet and then find you can't use it. So anyway, you get these sliders and they slide into your filing cabinet, and each of these sliders fits, I think it's 15 of these plastic little tabs, and each tab is for one thread. So you put your sticker, it comes with stickers, you put your sticker on, you write your number of your DMC in this case, and then you loop through your thread. And that's why earlier on I was talking about how I cut my threads to 1 meter, and I have 8 1 meter length threads. This is why I do that, so that I can keep them in my Annie's Keepers. And I just, when I get a new skein, I cut out 8 meter long lengths, and then I loop them through here, and then I work from here. And some of these are empty, I need to replenish them. So that's how they live in my filing cabinet. That's how my collection lives, on these tabs and then hanging down. I find they don't really get knotted. You would think they would get knotted, but they don't seem to. So that's how they live in the filing cabinet. And then when it comes to stitching my project, I have these other slides, which are called project slides. So they don't have the bumpy bits on the ends. And then I just, from my main collection, take out the tabs, or take out the threads that I need for that project. And it's easy enough to take them out. I'll show you on this one, because you can just snap them. So you snap them out of the filing cabinet sliders, and then you just snap them in to your project sliders. And then these are the colors that I need. I can hold them up for my Angel of Christmas. And as you can see, we have the blue threads here, of course. And on the end, I have this ring, and that's because the Annie's Keepers also have a hole in them that you can put the tabs on a ring if you would prefer to use a ring and not the sliders. So that's the Annie's Keepers system, the Annie's Keepers system that I use. Like I said, it's quite an investment. It's not really something you need. It's something that I invested in. I think it was like a birthday present to myself a few years ago, and I really love them, and I couldn't go away from them. But there's really absolutely no need to be spending lots of money if you're a new stitcher. But it's just nice to have a few different ideas for later down the line, because like I said, you might find that your collection of, particularly of cotton, builds very quickly, and then suddenly you've got hundreds, because there are 500 shades of DMC and a similar number of anchor. You have hundreds of these skeins, and they're all bundled in together, and you don't know how to separate them, and they're all getting mixed up, and they all sort of look the same, you know, a beige and another beige, they all look similar, and it can become a bit of a mess, and it can nearly turn you off your stitching. So if you get your organization in line relatively early in your cross stitch career, you will be so thankful in the long run. If you're wondering, do I keep my speciality threads on Annie's Keepers or on Bobbins or in a lovely organised way? The answer is no, I keep my speciality threads in a biscuit tin. And recently I opened up the biscuit tin and they all sort of erupted all over the place. And I said, oh, I must really organise these. So I made a huge effort and I went to the kitchen and I got 3 sandwich bags and I threw all the metallic threads in one sandwich bag and I threw the silk threads in another sandwich bag and then I threw everything else into the last sandwich bag, and then I got my lovely sandwich bags with my lovely threads and I shoved the sandwich bags back into the biscuit tin. So now whenever I open my biscuit tin, it's even more of a mess because there's sandwich bags taking up all the room. So that's my very high-tech organisational system for my speciality threads, and I am thinking about patenting that because I just find it so efficient. So that's all for this week and for this video on threads. I am aware that some of it may have been a little bit confusing, and I find that especially with threads, it's hard to explain what they really can do and how they really work unless you're actually demonstrating them. So we are going to be demonstrating them, of course, when we get to the actual stitching portion. For now, I really want to focus on just introducing the different types of materials and encouraging you to start collecting the materials you may need for your project. Next week, we're going to be talking about beads, and next week's video will be quite short. You'll be delighted to know, I think, after the last few videos, that next week's video will be a lot shorter. And at the end of next week's video, I am going to bring out a piece that I stitched, another lavender and lace piece that I stitched several years ago, and it features some of these materials. So it has beads, but it also has metallic threads. And I hope that when I show you that, you can really see what I'm talking about and you can really see the effect that these threads have. And then you'll start to say, oh, okay, I get it. I get why we're using these. And then when we get on to stitching with our cotton and then later stitching with our speciality threads, again, I hope that it will all start to click into place and you'll start to say, oh yeah, okay, now I get it. I am aware that this week it's just, well, this is this thread and this is this thread, and you know, it can be a little bit confusing. But for now, I just wanted to, like I said, introduce the different types of materials, and you can then hopefully familiarize yourself with what they look like and what you're looking for when you go to buy them, if they are what your chart calls for. So that's all for this week, and we'll see you next week for beads.